What if Naruto became the true successor of the Rasengan from childhood? Naruto x Hinata Part 1. The annoying buzz of a sleeper's worst foe was ringing loudly in his ears. With a frustrated growl, the mop of blonde hair tired to crawl deeper inside of his stiff pillow. As his groggy mind unwillingly returned to the land of the living, he lashed out blindly at the noise. Any relief he may have felt at striking the object was squashed when it fell from the bedside table and clattered loudly on the floor. Succumbing to anger, Naruto climbed out from his mattress to pummel the enemy of his sleep. He couldn't wait to become Hokage. Then he'd have the village's respect. He could walk proudly down the streets. People would smile and wave. Everyone would be happy and get a good night's sleep. Maybe he could pass a law that outlawed evil clocks. A glare at the aforementioned instrument made all thoughts vanish when what it was showing clicked in his befuddled brain. 6 o'clock in the morning, and the academy started at 6:30. That would mean, I'm gonna be late, he screamed as he jumped and tried to do a million things at once. He was trying to pull on a too large orange vest while holding a cup of instant ramen in one hand. The other hand was attempting to slip on a sandal that was obviously too large for his small feet as he rushed out his door. Despite how much of a hurry that he was in, he did take the time to pause long enough to lock his door. Then he sprinted as fast as his short legs could carry him. Dressed in a simple white kimono, a quiet, little girl stood outside the gate to Konohagakure's most prestigious clan. One would think that being the heir to the clan and a user of an advanced bloodline would have the girl carrying herself like some kind of royalty. But her face was down and her shoulders were slumped, suggesting a timid nature. She was waiting for a chunin to arrive and escort her to the Konoha Shinobi Academy. In a small bag in her hands was a bento and several writing utensils and accessories. The white lavender-eyed girl kept glancing from side to side, looking for the chunin lady. Sighing, Hinata began wondering if she should journey to the academy by herself. But this train of thought ended when she spotted a dust cloud and a rapidly growing orange figure approaching. A blonde-haired boy, probably close to her age, was running as fast as he could in clothes that barely fit him. As he was almost to her, he suddenly dropped a small package. He tried to stop and dash back for it, but he stumbled on his sandals and went tumbling in a heap to land at the startled Hinata's feet. Dropping her bag reflexively, she watched as the boy righted himself. Sitting up, he rubbed his sore head and aching chest, panting quite heavily. Peeking an eye open, he saw a pair of small feet and a bag beside them in front of him. Hinata had just worked up the courage to speak when the strange boy looked up. His face, though slightly tanned, was red as he tried to catch his breath. He tilted his face slightly to the side as he gazed at her with the brightest set of blue eyes she'd ever seen. Her cheeks instantaneously reddened slightly at his piercing yet gentle gaze. Chuckling loudly, he put on a large, toothy grin as he started rubbing the back of his neck. Just my luck to trip, Glancing around he spotted his ramen only a few feet away. Looking back up at the dark blue-haired girl, he tried to decide which he should do, make a friend or get to the academy. He chose the former, after all he didn't exactly know where the academy was. What's your name? A very large grin and eager eyes stared up at her as he continued, I'm Uzumaki Naruto, future Hokage of Konoha. He was talking to her and waiting for a reply. She knew that she had to answer. Her slightly red cheeks seemed to brighten as words twisted and tangled in her throat, never quite escaping. Finally, after much strain on her part, she managed to stutter out, Hyuga, Hyena, ta. Hyuga Hinata. He repeated, testing the name. Hi. Naruto's grin widened, but it seemed different than before. She didn't know exactly why, but this time it seemed to reach his eyes. Okay, he said happily. Do you know the way to the Shinobi Academy, Hinata-chan? This time her whole face turned a very bright Sakura. The only person to have called her Hinata-chan before was her mother. Hinata was spared from having to answer the question, however, when another female spoke up. She was just leaving for the academy, Uzumaki-san. Both children visibly jumped when they heard the voice. They faced the pretty, red-eyed Chunin with varying degrees of surprise, fear, and embarrassment. Hinata felt ready to faint at getting caught by surprise with this boy. Her already deep blush could easily decipher the degree of her embarrassment. Naruto could only look at the woman with fear that she might make him leave his new friend. Yuichi Kurenai watched the two children thoughtfully for a moment. She would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb to not see the beginnings of a crush in her young charge. And not a person in Konoha had no heard of the demon boys' dream of one day becoming Hokage. It took little imagination to see why the two were together. Picking up Naruto's forgotten cup of instant ramen, she handed it to him as he climbed to his feet. Glancing from one child to the next, she let a small smile out. These two would make an adorable couple in the future. Come on, Hyuga-sama, Uzumaki-san, she said as her smile widened slightly. We don't want you late for your first class. The statement earned her another blush from Hinata and a surprised, but fast-growing smile from Naruto. As the classroom began to fill, Yumino Iruka was able to identify a fair number of children from the more prominent of the Konoha clans. There was an Aburame boy who was as silent as a majority of his clan, an Akamichi boy who was looking around with uncertainty at the other children, a loud Inazuka boy who was trying to impress several other students, an unusually quiet Hyuga girl. The Nara boy seemed to be falling asleep where he sat as the Yamanaka girl beside him was trying to talk to him, and of course an Uchiha boy who was sitting quietly in seat. And last, but not least, there was one annoying blonde that he wished that he didn't have to deal with right now. Upon his entry into the classroom, the blonde had yelled out, "I'm Uzumaki Naruto. I'm gonna kick all your butts one day." This loud announcement had everyone's attention on him. Yet it might have been more impressive if he hadn't tripped on his hand-me-down sandals for the second time that day. Now burning with shame, Naruto was sitting crouched over in his seat. "All right, everyone," Iruka called out. "Please sit down and be quiet, class will be starting shortly." Once the ruckus had settled down somewhat, he said, "My name is Yumino Iruka. While you train here, you are to call me Iruka-sensei." Even as Iruka began his welcoming speech, he noticed several students' attentions wandering already. The one person who seemed to be the most interested was Naruto. But as all 6-year-olds did, he grew bored of Iruka's droning voice quickly enough. When the students began introducing themselves, the blonde could hardly wait. People would notice him, if for only a moment. This excitement was enough to squash his earlier embarrassment. He waited impatiently for the others to have their turns. But when it came for his turn, Iruka called the girl that was after him. Instantly Naruto was on his feet, cutting off Yamanaka Ino's introduction before it even began. "Iruka-sensei, it's my turn." "No," the scarred teacher said. "It would have been your turn if you hadn't felt the need to introduce yourself early." This got scattered snickers and giggles from the other students. Sputtering for a second, he threw a fierce glare at Iruka. "That's not fair. Life is never fair, Naruto," Iruka said gruffly, trying to suppress memories of his deceased parents. "Now sit down. Yamanaka-san, please continue." Very angry, Naruto spent the remainder of the morning sulking. Thanks to his inattention, he was spared having to notice a withering glare from the blonde girl that would have had him trembling in unconditional fear. When Iruka called a break between classes, Naruto was the only one to remain in the class. From his obvious frown and angry glare, he was still sulking. So Iruka let him be and left the room. Once class resumed, Iruka had the students get out their history books. He sat behind his desk as he lectured the beginning of their village and the importance of the shinobi clans. During the whole lecture, Naruto was staring at him with a peculiar look in his eye. It unnerved him enough to stand up to ask him what the problem was, or try to stand up. Upon a quick inspection, he found that the chair was apparently superglued to him. But he only figured this out after he stood up. The chair legs hit loudly against the wall behind him, attracting the attention of the rest of the class. As they watched Iruka try to figure out what possessed the seat to stick to him, the class broke out in loud snickers and giggles. But when Naruto finally lost control and fell out of his seat laughing, the rest of class quickly followed suit. Naruto. Ruruka's angry yell cut through the academy walls like a knife through butter. Detention tonight. He scrubbed. He swept. He mopped. And scrubbed some more. After what seemed like days, Naruto finally was able to put the cleaning supplies away. Ruruka had watched over him like a hawk the entire time, making sure he did every inch. Now the blonde boy stood in the center of a very clean floor. As he was walking for the door, Naruto's stomach let out a very loud grumble. Glancing down sadly at his empty belly, he could only pout. Ruruka-sensei hadn't even let him stop to have dinner. Naruto, the young teacher said, not the least bit sympathetic. Yes, sensei. The strain in the boy's voice to not start being verbally disrespectful was apparent from the glare he shot towards the Chunin. It's late, so, he paused, trying to think of a way to word his thoughts. I'll take you to a little restaurant for dinner, my treat. What do you say? He wasn't doing this because he liked the boy. But because, as a teacher, he needed to make sure the boy got at least a fair meal before going home. There was a moment of silence as Naruto's brain processed what it just heard. Then a slow smile broke out across his face. The next thing Ruruka knew, he had an orange bundle hugging him fiercely while thanking him over and over again. The restaurant turned out to be a little ramen stand called Ichiraku. After only one bowl of miso ramen, Naruto yelled out at the top of his lungs that this was the best ramen he'd ever tasted and that Ichiraku had just become his newest, most favorite restaurant in Konoha. He ended up having 9 more bowls. Ruruka was glancing at him with mixed feelings of surprise and disappointment. How could he eat so much ramen and not get sick? But because of the boy's surprising appetite, a considerable portion of his salary now lined the old man's pockets. My lord, Chuki said as he cleaned a table nearby. It hasn't been this cheerful around here since the Yondaime was last here. Really? Ruruka asked, facing the man. I didn't know he came here. Oh yes, Chuki said offhandedly. Quite often, actually. Who's Yondaime? Naruto asked innocently. You don't know. Both men asked simultaneously. Yondaime Hokage is the one who defeated Kyuubi no Kitsune 6 years ago, Ruruka said, switching into lecture mode automatically. He was a great man who loved this village and was a very, very strong shinobi. Chuki nodded. He was a genius with crafting seals and I heard he even created his own attack jutsu, the Rasengan, I believe. Completely odd, Naruto practically yelled out his questions in quick succession. Wow. What did it do? Can anyone teach me? Is it really powerful? I want another bowl. Chuckling, Chuki left to make the boy's 11th bowl. Ruruka stared down at the boy's hopeful face. The eagerness in his eyes was almost a palpable thing. The boy was going to hate what he was about to say. Sorry, Naruto, but no one knows anything about it. Yondaime was the only person who knew how to perform it, at least that's what I've been told. Naruto visibly deflated at that information. He had hoped to learn an awesome, ultra-super strong jutsu that proved he was destined to be Hokage. If being strong meant having strong techniques, and no one could teach him any, then. His head snapped up and a foxy grin spread across his face. The grin was infectious due to his pure sincerity. Then he said in a loud voice filled with determination 4 words that would change history. Then I'll make one. Naruto sat in his apartment, reading by the moonlight. The stove in his small home was the only source of heat, and that heat was scarce at best. If his window wasn't broken, the cramped home could have contained the warmth a little easier. Growling in frustration, Naruto slammed the book shut. It was as close to useless as it could get, only the theory and definitions of the use of chakra and hand seals. It didn't tell how to mold the chakra into the hand seals. Maybe he shouldn't have rushed off to buy the first book on chakra he saw. A wide yawn escaped him as he stood. Stretching, he felt relief surge through his sore limbs. Another yawn and he trudged over to shut off the stove. His small body was tired from all the stress it had gone through earlier. Even with his unusually high stamina, he was bone-weary. As soon as his head hit the pillow, he was asleep. Deception is an essential ability that all shinobi must have, Ruruka said to the class. To pretend you are weaker than you truly are can cause an overconfident opponent to underestimate you. That could allow you to either win a battle against an enemy of equal strength or to escape safely. The class seemed to be lulled into a trance by Iruka's speech. While several keywords did survive, most of the lecture fell on weak ears. It was understandable. Kids want to practice, train, or do something physical. Trapped in an uncomfortable chair of a hot classroom for a boring lecture was more than they could stand. But while their bodies couldn't leave, their minds wandered. Taking a brief pause, Iruka glanced up and saw that many eyes were glazing over in drowsiness and heads were drooping. Sighing, he walked to his desk and slammed the book down loudly on top of it. Instantly, all eyes were open and on him. Letting a small smirk cross his face, he called out, "Naruto." The blonde lifted his slouched head off his arm at the sound of his name. Looking up at his sensei, he said, "Hi, Iruka-sensei. What would be another use of deception that you could use in your everyday life?" he asked, watching the blonde expectantly. Desperately, Naruto tried to understand the word, deception, but he had rarely ever heard such a weird word used before. Well, if he couldn't answer the question right, then he could at least try to get a laugh out of it. "I'd use it to add more flavor to my miso ramen." Iruka gave a rather heated glare at the blonde. The uncertain laughter Naruto was trying to spread to the other students died as he noticed no one had even paid attention to him. "Sakura-san," Iruka said in a kind, if strained, voice. He was certain that if the kids weren't going to listen to him, then listening to their friends and classmates would aid them in remembering. "Same question." Sakura stared at Iruka for a moment with wide eyes. Her cheeks reddened as she felt the stares of the class heavily on her shoulders. Thinking for a moment, she tentatively answered. "Anyo, Iruka-sensei. If a shinobi wanted to hide a secret about himself or what he could do, he could act certain ways. He could do things that would make people think less of him." Smiling kindly, Iruka said, "Very good, Sakura-san. That is exactly what many shinobi do." Speaking louder, Iruka drew their attentions again. "Now it is time for your split training. All boys come with me. Girls, you shall remain here until your other sensei arrives in a few minutes." As the boys were filing out, Naruto heard a very faint gasp that sounded like, "Naruto-kun." Glancing at the girl he'd just passed, he saw white eyes and red cheeks. He smiled brightly at her for a moment. However, in doing so, he had paused right in the middle of the aisle and in front of a rather impatient Inuzuka. Kiba growled as he shoved Naruto out of his way. Ignoring the blonde, he continued forward. Thus he didn't see Naruto land in Sakura's lap. Sakura, having her back to him when it happened, retaliated with far more aggression than anyone had ever seen from her. "Get off me, Uzumaki!" she yelled angrily in his face as he futilely tried to apologize. Grabbing a handful of his hair, she pulled her free arm back. The next instant, Naruto was once again in front of Kiba but with a rapidly swelling eye. Sitting up, Naruto put on his favorite foxy grin. Ignoring the pain, he called out in a voice filled with awe. "That was an awesome punch, Sakura-chan." "Don't call me that." Sakura snapped, a throbbing vein just barely visible under her long pink bangs. "Why?" he asked innocently. "Because I'm not your friend, Baka," she growled. "Oh, okay," he said, sounding sad. Then, in the blink of an eye, his face changed back into its usual happy mask. "Bye, Sakura-chan." As the pink-haired kunoichi in training fumed, Hinata felt a tight knot tie itself around her. Rapidly growing depressed, she couldn't help but ask to herself, did Naruto-kun like Sakura-san? Did he still want to be her friend? Was she even worthy of being his friend? But through her depression, she found that she probably wouldn't have the courage to talk to him for a little while. The walk home for him was a particularly peaceful one for him. The villagers didn't spare him a second glance. It seemed as though they were taking a short break from tormenting him. That alone put him into a good mood. But he'd also finally learned how to tap into his chakra today. It was a lot harder than he thought it would have been, requiring intense concentration. The goal Iruka had given the class was to channel chakra throughout every part of his body. It took him much longer than any of the other students, but he'd been able to get it after a while. Racing through Konoha as fast as he could go, he made a beeline for his apartment. After a small meal of 5 instant ramen packages, he propped himself on his bed to practice the chakra molding again. He knew if he could master this ability quickly, he'd be another step closer to his ultimate goal. Replaying the lecture through his mind, he focused. As he felt the chakra rising and being channeled, a fragment of the lecture floated through his mind. It, specifically, was Sakura's speech on what current shinobi do to hide things. If a shinobi wanted to hide a secret about himself or what he could do, he could act certain ways. He could do things that would make people think less of him. Yes, that's what I'll do, he thought as he let the chakra slip away. A devious grin broke across his face as he imagined what was to come in the future. I'll act, nobody will know or even guess what I'm doing. Almost 6 years have passed since Uzumaki Naruto, unofficial demon of the Leaf Village, entered the Shinobi Academy. The village has had a number of pranksters in the past, but none would probably ever be as infamous as Naruto. He pulled pranks as a means of petty vengeance, to relieve boredom, or to brighten an occasionally bad day. In short, almost everyone has been a victim of his. Today, the terrible prankster stood in the middle of a wooded area. Carefully checking that he was alone, he smiled. Years of pulling pranks in village dominated by large numbers of shinobi had forced him to adapt and develop skills that he probably wouldn't have acquired for some time. Like to sense when a person was nearby, even though they're hidden, and to notice in the slightest change of wind any new sense it carried. In all, he was gifted with sensory abilities of such thoroughness that they put most Junins to shame. Going through the necessary hand seals, he engaged his first attempt at creating his own jutsu. His original inspiration for it came from a simple henge. If shinobi were meant to be spies, then he should create a super cool henge that would be the ultimate spying ability. So he spent some time observing older shinobi, and what he found disgusted him. Most shinobi were males, and near all of them were perverts. That ruled out the choice of what the henge would appear as. He started practicing with normal henges. The first ones merely gave him more feminine features and a pair of pigtails. That was the easy part. Then he tried to make the henge a bit more scantily clad, wearing only her undergarments. For some reason, he could tell it was far from perfect. Dropping the henge after another failed attempt, he sat down to ponder what was wrong. He knew what the ultimate goal of this jutsu was to be, perverted as it was. He knew it had to be completely perfect for it to work successfully. So far he could get the shape of the arms, legs, and face. But because he didn't know what a truly girl looked like. That's it, he cried out, jumping to his feet. He left his training area behind in a blur. It took only a short run before he was back in Konoha. His destination was the nearest bookstore, since he wouldn't demean himself to peep like a pervert. Silently slipping past the drowsy man, Naruto found his needed research material. Chuckles broke out of his throat as he mesmerized the shapes, curves, and angles of the women in the magazine. Oh, he hated perverts, but it would be so much fun to see their reactions to this jutsu. Get out of my store, Naruto, a voice filled with menace growled from behind and above him. Flinching at getting caught, the boy glanced nervously behind him. The expression on the once sleepy man's face promised immediate and painful retaliation should he not comply with the demands. I need a sparring partner, he thought moodily. He had just spent the last 3 hours honing his accuracy with kunai and shuriken, then alternating between his taijutsu and ninjutsu. While his form was nearly perfect, the lack of a decent or superior partner was preventing him from reaching new heights. The only thing he wanted was to kill his. No, he wouldn't even consider that man any relation to himself, that man who had so easily destroyed his life and clan. For his vengeance, he needed far more power. For that, he needed a partner. Having grown irritated with his solo practice, Uchiha Sasuke left his training field. At first he merely walked through the streets of Konoha, looking for something that could entered in him enough to get his inspiration to train back up while avoiding that ridiculous fan club he'd somehow acquired. He almost wished that blonde Baka would make a random appearance. What that dobe seemed to possess was an uncanny ability to both piss him off while giving his ego a good boost. As if Sasuke had performed Kuchio's no jutsu, the blonde appeared on the street at his feet after having been thrown out of the door of a bookstore. Naruto had what looked like a growing bruise on his right eye. "Don't let me catch you in my store again, Uzumaki." A man growled dangerously from inside the store that Naruto had made a rather ungraceful exit from. Not waiting for a reply, the man slammed the door shut. "When I become Hokage, I'm gonna cook you over a slow fire, Tem," the blonde growled moodily, more to himself than anyone else. Sasuke smirked conceitedly, which drew Naruto's attention. "The day you become a kage will be a sad day indeed." "Shut up, Sasuke Tem," Naruto yelled as he bounced to his feet. "Adobe will never be anything other than Adobe, Baka," Sasuke said as he started to walk away. He knew he was pushing Naruto's buttons, but he was bored. Clenching his jaw and fists tightly, Naruto tried to think up a comeback, but as usual Sasuke seemed to be leaving him in the dust. If there was one thing that he truly couldn't stand, it was Sasuke's superiority complex with him. Perverts, the unyielding villagers, hatred of him, and his frustration at not completing his own jutsu all took the backseat when the last Uchiha was involved. As the Uchiha was strutting away, Naruto lost his temper. Dashing for the unprotected boy's back with all the speed he could muster, he let an angry roar of, "I'm gonna crush you, Tem." Sasuke hardly moved until Naruto was nearly on top of him. Then, faster than Naruto could react, Sasuke ducked under the punch as he swept his leg back. This resulted in Naruto being tripped and, with his momentum built up to its maximum, was sent tumbling down the street a short ways. After reorienting himself for a second, Naruto was charging Sasuke again. His fist nearly touched the dark-haired boy as he sailed in again. Merely shifting his weight, his knee came up and into the blonde's gut. Withdrawing, Sasuke spun on his anchored heel and he sent Naruto flying through the air with a sweeping kick. This kick sent the blonde crashing through the window of a store. The stoic mask slipped slightly as he heard the surprised, then furious yells of the customers and employees inside as Naruto futilely tried to apologize and escape. Deciding he had sufficiently inflated his pride for the moment, he walked away. Behind him, he heard Naruto get thrown back out into the street. Across from the store he'd made a similar exit from with a growing bruise around the other eye as well. He was in a very foul mood, so he spared no prisoners on his little battlefield. Slurping up the remainder of the ramen, he placed the bowl on the rather high stack of the dozen already consumed bowls. The pile promised to continue climbing as he hollered for another. As he waited for his miso ramen to arrive, he took up a slightly disheveled scroll from the side. On it were the instructions for the different uses of chakra and how to manipulate it. Scribbled along the edges of the scroll were notes he'd written. After finally completing his first jutsu, he started on plans for his second. It took him many hours of secretive researching, stress, and one dumb cat chasing a ball for him to finally get an idea. What he needed was a much more detailed description for chakra usage and control. But the academy just didn't have what he was looking for. Even though he'd begged and pleaded until he was blue in the face, he couldn't wrestle the information out of Iruka-sensei, who'd finally started to treat him a bit more humanely. Iruka claimed that if Naruto couldn't get the basics of the basics completely, then he most certainly couldn't do the more advanced practices. Next, Naruto took his complaints to the old man, but Sandaime seemed to agree with Iruka. Naruto's frustration at getting denied by the people he most respected was taking him to a breaking point, and the only other alternative that he really didn't want to do. Just as he seemed ready to commit theft, the scroll appeared. He'd opened his apartment door one morning as he was rushing to the academy and slipped on it. Though there was no one in sight, he could faintly smell the lingering scent of lilacs. Naruto was so happy that the scroll held all the information that he needed that he made no attempt to pay attention in class that day, instead focusing on reading the scroll. Now that he had it, what kind of jutsu would he make? Of the basic elements that most jutsus were derived from, he couldn't make up his mind between fire or electricity. As he pondered this dilemma, he began to absent-mindedly start stirring his ramen slowly. What he wanted was a jutsu that could do a lot of damage in an instant. Now he reasoned that a stabbing jutsu could easily live up to that condition, but the thought of shoving his arm through a person's body didn't sit too well with his stomach. Sighing in defeat, he glanced down at his bowl. The noodles were tangled around his chopsticks in a spiral pattern while the soup swirled around, giving the ramen a distinctive spinning motion. Swirling, spinning, drilling. An excited cry of victory tore itself from Naruto. The answer was simple. A drilling jutsu could do the most damage, especially if it spread out once inside enemy's body. Now he just needed to find a technique that would teach him how to spin chakra. As this thought was forming in his mind, he discovered the answer to it almost simultaneously. Ramen had all answers. Water. With water he could feel the chakra moving and feel how well it was working. But he couldn't hold water, obviously, so he'd need a water balloon to get started. First, he'd need to learn how to spin the water inside the balloon at great speeds. Then, because it was an expanding drill, so to say, he'd need to somehow destroy the balloon. As to how he could do this, he wasn't sure, but he decided to cross that bridge when he came to it. Quickly finishing and paying for his meal, he left. Stuffing the scroll into the pouch he wore on his belt on his new orange jumpsuit, he raced off to the nearest store he could find. Ignoring the icy glares the adults shot him, he grabbed a whole handful of balloons from the jar by the cash register. As usual, he was forced to pay a horrendously inflated price, even for balloons. Racing out of the door, Naruto had every intention of running off to his secret training area. But he ran face first into an unyielding wall of muscle. From his new position on the ground, surrounded by his new balloons, he glared hotly up into two pairs of cold white eyes. Cold eyes watched the confrontation between the Hyuga clan members and the Bane of Konoha. The man wore merely a simple Chunin flak jacket and the normal shinobi accessories. His face was bland with no distinguishing features. He watched disdainfully as the Hyuga snarled at the boy. As they got into a heated battle of wits and words, the man couldn't help but question the level of intelligence of the villagers. Why couldn't they see that there was a large and rather obvious difference between a loud, attention-starved child and the incomprehensible, bloodthirsty Kyuubi? Oh well, at least this dark life had the potential to make him stronger. That would make his job more interesting in the long run. Smirking, the man left the scene as one of the Hyuga used the Hake Rokujian show on the loud blonde as it seemed he'd gotten the better of the two verbally. The boy's loud and rather colorful curses escorted him out of the village. The man's smirk didn't fade, not even after he dropped the three-layered henge. His blood-red eyes seemed to glow in anticipation. Only a little while longer, he thought relatively gleefully. Then, we'll be ready. He'd only come into this section of town twice that he could remember. The first had been when he'd gotten lost on his way to the Shinobi Academy on his first day oh so long ago. The second had been only a few days afterward, when he'd tried to come and play with Hinata-chan. But he'd been more than unpleasantly threatened, or as they said, promised many gruesome and painful experiences should he return to their area again. Since then, he'd avoided the section like the plague. Those white-eyed bastards were all over the place here. That was because their clan compound seemed to be located here. He disliked them very much because of the look of superiority all of them seemed to share. All of them were uptight, arrogant bastards who really needed to be brought back down to earth. So he now considered it his sworn duty to do just that. It was high time that they learned that they weren't all powerful. That was the reason why he was here now in the dead of night, revenge, Naruto style. After the Hyuga closed his Tenketsu points, he had hurried off to his apartment to rest. For some reason that he couldn't understand when he tried to do his chakra molding exercises, he couldn't bring it out. It was like it was being blocked off or something. As he futilely tried to access his chakra, a brilliant idea had formed in his mind. Using his considerable stealth to the absolute best of his ability, he snuck inside the Hyuga compound. Then, from one building to another, he raided their homes. Though he was extremely careful what he took, only the most humiliating of things that he could. He had once heard of the abilities of the legendary Byakugan, to see through things, to see people's inner chakra coils, and nearly 360 degrees of vision. So if he made even the slightest noise, a board creak, a sneeze, even breathing too loud, he knew he'd be in a world of pain. He would immediately hinge into a section of the floor or a rug if he heard the slightest sound or smelled something out of place. This paranoia proved invaluable as he almost was caught by a drowsy guard who was making his hourly routine. It took him more than 3 hours to finish his goal, but it was worth it in his eyes. One of the last rooms he slipped into, his nose was embraced by a familiar and comforting scent. It was the smell of flowers, or more specifically lilacs. A smell he'd come to associate with only one person. Hinata-chan. He could see her sleeping on her bed, wrapped up snugly in her bed covers. Her face was relaxed and peaceful. It held not trace of a blush he'd always seen on her or the timid persona she possessed. Though he had always kind of thought of her as a weird, dark, and shy girl, this new Hinata seemed. Shaking his head to get his mind back on the plan, he took a deep breath and sighed. One last glance at the sleeping girl stole his resolve. He couldn't do it to her. She was just too kind to him and everyone else to have something like what he had in mind to happen to her. He shot her a rueful grin as he backed out of the room. Only one word could be used to describe the village hidden in the leaves the next morning: chaotic. Scattered throughout the leaf village was nearly the entire Hyuga clan's clothing and undergarments. They were thrown about the streets, in alleyways, on top of buildings, and even hanging mockingly in trees. While the villagers and Hyuga clan were busy trying to handle the situation, most of the shinobi populace was chasing a near hyperventilating prankster from one side of Konoha to the other and back. If they weren't busy from collecting their clothing, the Hyuga would have most assuredly thrown a lot more than glares at the blonde as he passed them. Finally, with nearly 4 full squads of Chunin, Junin, and Anbu surrounding him, Naruto was cornered. He was on his hands and knees, struggling to breathe. But his short of breath didn't come from the rigorous chase and escape he'd just been in. "How could you do that to the Hyuga clan, Naruto?" snapped an aggravated Chunin dangerously. "Because they're fucking bastards, baka." He shot back. Unsteadily, he climbed to his feet with his infamous foxy grin. "That may be so," a Junin said to his side. "But that doesn't justify your actions." Uzumaki, an Anbu said with a clear order in his voice. "You're going to the Sandaime, now come quietly and your punishment be reduced." "No way," Naruto yelled, his foxy grin widened noticeably. It automatically put the shinobi on edge. This was the perfect time, he realized, to test his first original jutsu. "I haven't tested my first jutsu. You'll love it." Forming the Ohatsuji seal, his grin covered his face. Enveloped in his chakra, he cried out, "Waroke no jutsu." In a burst of smoke, the most beautiful blonde girl they'd ever seen appeared. She had slender limbs, a pair of long ponytails, dazzling blue eyes, and her whisker marks just added a seductiveness to her that made her seem to just be dripping with sexiness. But what really caught their attentions was the fact that she was totally before them and didn't seem to mind showing off her rather substantial assets. They were not expecting this. Thus, since all the shinobi were males, no one was there to stop the blonde boy when he took off again. This time, there was no mistaking the loud, irritating laughter that echoed across the village for the rest of the morning. It seems all things have a silver lining, even punishments. In Naruto's case, it was learning the fastest routes to the summit of the Hokage monument. That had been the punishment for the Hyuga incident, to scrub the monument every evening for the next 3 months. Now, to celebrate the end of his probation, he pulled easily the most infamous of all pranks ever. He put graffiti all over the past cage's faces. As if it were a repeat from several months earlier, the blonde was once again being chased throughout Konoha. But this time it was only by a pair of Chunin. While he was enjoying the chase, the blonde was also having an almost unholy amount of fun thanks to 2 of his latest jutsus. When the Chunin pair first started chasing him, he inhaled deeply, then blew a dense smokescreen around himself. Once they lost sight of him, he took off running. But they found him easily enough due to his ridiculously loud voice as he laughed off the simplicity of his escape. Then Chunin were almost on him when he put his second jutsu to work. It surrounded his body in a haze of chakra and blurred his image. This made it extremely difficult for the pair to grab onto him. Naruto. One of them yelled. Get back here. When I get my hands on you. You've crossed the line this time, Naruto. The other yelled, purposely interrupting his partner. Give it up. You're just bent because you don't have the guts to do what I did, do ya? Losers. Wannabes. Taking the chase up into the air and the taller buildings, Naruto yelled out mockingly at them as he rebounded off a building and sailed right between the pair. You'll never catch me. Landing briefly, he dodged around a corner and vanished from sight. The Chunin were only a hair's breadth away, sailing around the corner while yelling at the energetic blonde. Once the pair disappeared over a building, a small tarp lowered from its position on the wall. Chuckling once again at the simplicity of his escape, Naruto proudly proclaimed, "That was too easy." "Oh yeah, Naruto." A familiar, angry voice snapped in his ear. Yelping in shock and reflexively jumping several feet in the air, Naruto collapsed on the ground. Facing the man who'd snuck up on him, he gave him irritated glare. "Where'd you come from, Iruka-sensei? What are you doing here? No, what are you doing here?" Iruka snapped, pointing his finger in Naruto's face threateningly. "You're supposed to be class." Iruka was giving him another lecture. But Naruto, as usual, wasn't even trying to pay attention. Instead, he put on a big show of pouting like a baby in front of the class from his bound position on the floor. Apparently this didn't sit too well with Iruka, and he did the same thing that most teachers do to inspire cooperation among teammates. "Fine, because you missed it, Naruto," he said with finality in his voice. "Everyone in class shall review the Henge no Jutsu." This got a chorus of groans and complaints from the class instantly. Untying the blonde, Iruka sent back with his classmates as they gathered in the front of the classroom. Truth be told, Iruka had been planning on reviewing this jutsu with class for several days now. Naruto's prank seemed as good of an excuse as any to use. Most of the students were acceptable with the skill, but he didn't want to send his students out into the shinobi world with only an acceptable skill level. Of course several students were unusually talented. Sakura was the most talented, it seemed, thanks to her near-perfect chakra control. When it came time for Naruto's turn, he could clearly see the irritated glint in his usually bright, happy eyes. Thanks to years of teaching the blonde, Iruka saw the faint warning signs that he was going to do something. The small foxy grin on his face only reinforced this. Silently watching her blonde crush as he made his way forward, Hinata timidly poked her index fingers together. A faint blush was visible as usual while she watched and silently cheered for him. "Henge no Jutsu," Naruto said, as his chakra surrounded him. In a poof of smoke, a very beautiful blonde girl stood in his place. She blew a kiss at Iruka as she winked innocently. Even though he'd heard of this, Iruka was still not prepared for it and was sent flying from a massive burst of blood. Dropping the henge, Naruto's loud laughter echoed through the quiet room. "Gotcha," he laughed. "That's my Warok no Jutsu. Cut the stupid tricks," the young teacher yelled in his face. "This is your last warning." Class had a rather peculiar air about it today. Anxiety was so thick that it was almost visible to the naked eye. Yet an undercurrent of excitement and determination gave the atmosphere a definite charge. The only time this happened was when the class was taking a significant test. But this time it was 10 times worse, their genin exams. Thus far they had been tested on taijutsu, weapons accuracy, basic genjutsu, and first aid. But this was after an hour-long written test on shinobi laws of conduct, common courtesy, and interactions with another shinobi village. Sakura aced the written test easily, with Sasuke only a few points behind. But for the more practical test, Sasuke lived up to his reputation of being the #1 rookie. If he'd have wanted, he knew for a fact that he could have aced the written test and come near the top for the second half. But as it were, he was more content to score average. After all, it was just too troublesome to do more than that. While watching clouds was far more alluring, he also decided it would prove to be worth his time to run mental estimate of who would get what grade to pass or fail. It was almost too easily to guess on almost everyone, except for Naruto. Shikamaru had always been a little more observant than the others, perhaps due to his cloud-watching pastime. Due to this, he felt sure that he knew why the blonde always failed. He wasn't focused on his studies in the academy or even all those pranks. No, he was much more interested in developing his own jutsus and abilities for some unknown but obsessive reason. It wasn't a matter of ability that held him back either, for only an exceptionally skilled stealth and scouting specialist could perform so many pranks and usually escape unscathed. And due to his pranks, Shikamaru knew Naruto was smart. The ingeniousness in some of his pranks proved it. Sighing in defeat at the surprisingly complex puzzle that was the dead last, Shikamaru returned his attention to Choji. The pudgy boy was proudly detailing his exam in between chewing a bag of potato chips. Hey, too bad he didn't share the same simple-mindedness as his lifelong friend, he mused. Or else he wouldn't have an approaching headache. Though he'd never admit it if the Nara boy told him his theories, Naruto's rather poor grades came from exactly those reasons. When he was younger he'd made such an attempt at being a screw-up that it actually began to become a part of his personality as far as the academy was concerned. His true focus had been on making his own jutsus. While he himself didn't exactly know the reason for his obsessive research and creation of the techniques, he had a fair idea where it came from. He was an orphan with no clan. So no one was there to teach him jutsus that only family knew. It drove him to almost a depressed mind frame whenever he thought about the special training almost all his classmates got, but not him. So he felt an irresistible urge to create jutsus that he could proudly yell out were his and his alone. Yet his lack of focus cost him to fail the last 2 genin exams. So far, he'd done hardly any better than last time. When Iruka announced that the final exam was the Bushin no Jutsu, Naruto almost caused an embarrassing scene. He had to clamp his hands over his mouth to stop from screaming in frustration. He could not perform that simple ninjutsu if his life depended on it, like there was some cosmic deity that was preventing him from even doing it properly. Now, as he stood before Iruka and the new academy sensei Mizuki, he had a deep frown on his face. It was now or never if he could get that jutsu right. His gathered chakra perfectly visible to the naked eye as he concentrated hard on pouring an excessive amount into his hand seals. Bushin no Jutsu, he called out as the chakra exploded around him and kicked up a cloud of smoke. When it cleared, there were 2 Naruto, but the difference between them was like night and day. One was the real, while the clone was a sickly pale white and lying dead on the floor. A second of silence greeted Naruto's nervous, twitching body. He knew it was coming, especially the way that Iruka's eyebrow was twitching. Then, you fail. He sat on the only swing in the academy yard, in the shade of the trees. His face was sullen and his eyes were downcast. Leaning his head against the swing's rope, he was the perfect picture of dejection. Across the yard was a large group of children who had passed their genin exams, and their parents stood proudly at their sides, congratulating them while boasting to other parents. He watched them with a deepening hollow feeling in his stomach. The loneliness was getting worse these days. It wouldn't be long before he did something that would either make him or the villagers crack. All he wanted was a real friend, someone to talk and laugh with on a regular basis. Sure, Iruka seemed to be doing a good job at that, but he was still Naruto's sensei. There was only so much time he could spare on the blonde. Placing his goggles onto his forehead, he was about to get up to leave when he sensed someone suddenly appear near him. Looking up in the tree, he saw Mizuki-sensei looking down at him with what could almost be considered a calculating gaze. But it quickly vanished as a kind smile lit up the man's face. Mizuki watched the blonde run off, his cheerful attitude once again restored. When the boy was safely out of sight, his gaze darkened considerably as a wicked grin of anticipation appeared. The blonde boy had been surprisingly easy to convince. He didn't know whether to be relieved or worried about the ease of it. But he settled for relief. After all, he was Chunin and that demon vessel's body probably was too weak to wield the awesome powers of the Kitsune once held. This thought had his sneer turning malicious. The Kyuubi seemed to have lost its memory, or it was biding its time, waiting for the right time to return. Whatever the reason, Mizuki was sure that the situation was safely in his control. His plan was ingenious. He hadn't spent the last year mesmerizing the schedules of the comings and goings at the Hokage Tower, searching for the exact location of the Forbidden Scroll, and finding a plausible explanation as to how it could suddenly go missing. It was Naruto's poor grades and his loud mouth that drew Mizuki's attention. The Kyuubi wanted to be Hokage, huh? Well, the fact that his abilities were the weakest of the academy students pretty much guaranteed that he'd fail. The Kitsune must be getting desperate to become a shinobi now. What better way to gain its trust than to stand up for it during its failed attempt in the exam and then telling it of a secret way to pass? Mizuki warned him not to try to retrieve the scroll until late at night, just to make it easier on his part of getting it. It would be a long few hours before he could safely make his move at getting what should have been his birthright. But, in the meantime, he could plan out how he would deal with the Kyuubi when the time came. Nobody would miss him, he was just the human form of the demon fox. Chuckling sinisterly under his breath, Mizuki turned and headed back to the academy. He may not be staying the village for much longer, but he couldn't afford to blow his cover just yet. It was well past midnight. He was sitting on the ground in front of an old warehouse in the middle of the forest, almost a mile from Konoha. In his lap was a very large and heavy scroll. Gently, almost respectfully, he untied the ropes that held it shut and its secrets hidden from the world. Unrolling it across his lap, he gazed upon it with wide eyes. The thrill of learning a powerful jutsu that no one his age could possibly know was enough to drive him ecstatic. But as he read the name of the first jutsu, his excitement died like it had been squashed by a bug. Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, he said quietly. Taju. That meant mass, while Kage was shadow, but Bunshin could only mean. Yelling out in disbelief at this ridiculous coincidence, he groaned out, "Not this again. It's my worst jutsu." He really didn't want to learn this technique, but Mizuki-sensei said that any technique would do. Maybe this technique was different from the one they thought in the academy. As this thought passed his mind, he grew certain of it. Why else would it be in the Forbidden Scroll if it wasn't different? Reading the brief explanation of the jutsu that was next to its name, he stared in disbelief. Then a sly foxy grin broke across his face. If he could master this jutsu, he'd never lose to Sasuke again, and the title of Hokage would most assuredly be his in a few years. With a renewed determination, Naruto quickly set about learning what would soon become his early trademark jutsu. It was nearing morning, a faint violet appearing on the eastern horizon. The blonde boy was sitting in a hunched posture and was panting heavily. The stolen scroll was strapped to his back and seemed to be weighing him down as he fought to catch his breath. This was how Iruka found Naruto. The blonde looked up in surprise when he heard the scarred sensei land near him. Iruka chuckled almost menacingly as he bent over the boy. "It's all over," he said with that voice that he always used when Naruto was about to get in serious trouble. Instead of noticing his sensei's dangerous expression, Naruto closed his eyes and chuckled good-naturedly. His legs wobbled slightly as he stood up, scratching the back of his head nervously. "Got me already," he said, slightly disappointed. "You're quick, sensei. I only had time to learn 2 techniques." Standing up, Iruka peered quizzically at his blonde student. Sweat was glistening from his face and his legs seemed just barely able to contain the strength to hold him up. He had only seen Naruto like this when he was training. He's been out here practicing, he realized. I can tell how hard he's been working. "Listen, sensei," Naruto said suddenly, his grin large. "I'm going to show you one of my amazing jutsus and you're going to let me graduate. That's how it works, right? Whoever learns at least one jutsu from this scroll passes." "What?" Iruka asked, confused. "Where'd you get that idea?" "Mizuki-sensei told me," Naruto said happily, practically bouncing as he felt his strength fast returning. He told me where to find the scroll in this place. He trailed off as he noticed two things: Ruruka's expression as he put things together and the sudden sound of kunai rushing through the air. Hearing the sound at the same time, but reacting faster, Ruruka shoved Naruto out of the way of the deadly hail of daggers. The force of the multiple kunai pushed him back against the warehouse wall. It was extremely lucky for Ruruka that he'd worn his Chunin flak jacket, of several of the kunai would have buried themselves in his abdomen. As it were, only one actually pierced his body, just above his right knee. "I see you've found our little hideaway," a familiar voice said from the forest canopy. Sandaime Hokage was sitting at his desk. In front of him was a crystal ball on a small cushion. He gazed steadily into its depths, watching the events in the forest commence. It had shocked him slightly to learn that Mizuki was the one really behind the theft of the Forbidden Scroll. He'd been monitoring all the Chunin, Junin, and Anbu that were scouring the village in a desperate attempt to find the scroll. He'd been lucky that he was paying particularly close attention to Ruruka. After all, the man seemed to have a knack at finding Naruto when he had done something wrong. He sighed in resignation as he listened to Mizuki's proclamation of Naruto being the Kyuubi no Kitsune. That baka didn't even know the difference between the blonde and fox. But, apparently, it hit Naruto harder than he thought it would. When Ruruka was able to trick Mizuki, he couldn't help but smirk slightly. For all his boasts that he was superior to him, Mizuki fell for that hench quite quickly. Then, as Ruruka had saved Naruto from a hail of kunai, the blonde suddenly saved Ruruka from being torn apart by the traitor's shuriken. What really caught Sandaime's attention was the blonde forming a familiar crossed seal that was the signature of the Kage Bunshin. The old man couldn't help but chuckle as the Kyuubi vessel filled the surrounding area with 1,000 shadow clones and Mizuki's panicked disbelief. He promptly stopped watching when all Naruto charged. The outcome was obvious, but he had another matter to attend to: informing the searching nins of the scroll's safety. His small smile didn't fade as a stray thought crossed his mind. Minato's legacy was certainly living up to his expectations, being the #1 most surprising shinobi of his generation. He could see the morning's light through his closed eyelids. Even though it was covered, it was still blinding. The irritation made itself known as he let out a complaint. "Ruruka-sensei, how much longer?" "Okay," the young man said quietly. "You can open your eyes now." The sight that greeted him was Ruruka's smiling face. He held Naruto's goggles in one hand. But what caught the blonde's attention was his forehead was clearly visible, devoid of his headband. That's when he realized where it had disappeared to. It was tied snugly onto his own forehead. "Congratulations," Ruruka said, with genuine cheer in his voice. "You graduate. And to celebrate, I have a surprise: we're going out for ramen tonight." Naruto was silent. He couldn't believe all this was happening at last. He'd finally been allowed to graduate. He finally found someone who actually believed in him. Even though he'd stolen a highly dangerous artifact from the Hokage Tower and used it, he was still allowed to become a genin. It was too much for him to put into words to describe his joy. Looking down at the blonde as the silence started to stretch, he was greeted by a loud, joyful yell. "Ruruka-sensei!" rang out Naruto's happy voice in his ears as he was tackled against the tree with the boy giving him a fierce hug. He sat in the classroom resting his head on his arms on the table, a wide grin on his face as a low chuckle escaped him very few moments. On his forehead was Ruruka's headband, which he had spent the almost 2 hours last cleaning and polishing. He couldn't believe his incredible good luck at finally becoming a genin. In his mind's eye were the 2 jutsus that he'd mesmerized from the scroll. Kage Bunshin had been the easiest for him to learn, surprisingly. It seemed that his years of studying chakra usage and manipulation had paid off. He learned the kinjutsu in less than half the time it probably could have taken him. The second kinjutsu was far harder to control because it required so much damn chakra. He could perform it at what could shakily be called the bare minimum of its true capabilities. In fact, that was reason that Ruruka found him in such exhaustion the other night. He knew that he'd needed to nearly triple his current chakra potency if he was going to be able to use it effectively and not die of chakra depletion. So, He'd just have to wait to use it. Not that he was in a hurry to show off what could possibly become his hidden ace. He was pried from his examinations of his jutsu ace when a familiar voice spoke to him. "What are you doing here, Naruto?" Shikamaru asked. "This class isn't for dropouts. You can only be here if you graduated." Sitting up, Naruto tapped Iruka's leaf headband that he wore proudly. He couldn't help but to add a bit of sarcasm to his voice as he answered. "Oh yeah, see this? Open your eyes, Shikamaru, it's a regulation headband." The Nara boy scrawled at the blonde's attitude. He quickly zoned out as Naruto launched into a speech of how the headband was meant for him. But where Shikamaru hardly heard a word, Hinata was hanging onto every syllable. Her curiosity was starting to eat at her as to how he passed. She had been sure that he had failed once again. A rather loud commotion from the doorway behind her drew Naruto's attention toward her, and Shikamaru used the distraction to escape. It was almost painfully easy to determine who the girls were behind her, even without using her Byakugan. Ino and Sakura. It was especially easy to guess from the way Naruto's face started to redden. Since she was more concerned with watching Naruto, she could have sworn that he was actually looking at her. This thought brought a small blush to her face. It deepened slightly when she saw Naruto's blush get deeper. Was he actually looking at her? That question seemed to be answered when his face suddenly started moving, following Sakura's movements. He stood up and waved to her, calling a happy greeting. Her response, "Move it," she snarled, knocking him aside. She did this so she could stand close to Sasuke as she asked in what she thought was a sweet and endearing voice. "Good morning, Sasuke, do mind if I sit next to you?" The Uchiha heir only spared her a glance before he returned to his brooding. It was like this every morning, this routine. If it wasn't Sakura or Ino, then it was some other kunoichi wannabe. He was getting quite sickened of the repetitious behavior these girls exhibited. So he becoming a genin was an even bigger relief than he wanted to admit. Getting up with a glare, Naruto worked his way around the gathered and arguing kunoichi. With a small hop, he was landed on Sasuke's desk and squatted down. He glared at his rival, trying to see what was so special about him that made most of the girls turn into such bitches. To his eyes, all Sasuke was and would ever be was pretty boy who looked more like a girl than a shinobi. "Naruto," Sakura snapped. "Hey, stop glaring at Sasuke." The blonde spared the pink-haired girl a small, hurt glance. Then he promptly returned to glaring and scrutinizing the Uchiha. Sasuke returned the glare full force, making a mental note to beat the crap out of the blonde later. This glaring contest turned out to be a big mistake on both their parts as another genin hopeful accidentally bumped into Naruto. The bump, however soft, was more than enough to send the blonde face first into Sasuke's face. Though it lasted scarcely a nanosecond, that unintentional and utterly disgusting kiss was forever burned into the minds of the gathered girls. Neither boy noticed the darkening expressions of the incredibly angry and jealous kunoichi as they broke apart and immediately started to gag like they'd been poisoned. It was only when a wave of killing desire washed over him that Naruto felt it. "Danger. Naruto," Sakura said in deceptively calm voice, speaking for the girls behind and beside her. "You are so dead. Most promising, young student, Uchiha Sasuke," a Junin said quietly. Gazing into the Hokage's crystal at the brooding youth, he asked, "Is that him?" "Yes," the Sandaime confirmed. "He's the only survivor of the Uchiha clan," muttered Kurenai, the newest and only female Junin of the gathered shinobi. She was looking for a familiar Hyuga girl, Hinata. It had been a few years since she'd last seen the girl, having to escort her to the academy when she was younger. Though she personally didn't appreciate the kind of attention that her father gave her, she could fully understand his need for precaution, especially after that Kumogakure incident almost 10 years earlier. So she felt it her duty to continue watching over her, and she all but demanded that the Hyuga be placed on her team. "That's right," Sandaime confirmed again as he sent the crystal ball into zoom in on the other students as well. It was a practice that was started with the Shodai Hokage, showing the Junin instructors the genin hopefuls through the crystal so they'd have some idea as to what their possible students looked like. As it came upon the group of gathered and bickering kunoichi, all the Junin noticed one hot-headed blonde make his way over to the Uchiha. A silver-haired Junin watched the pair's confrontation with interest since he already knew that they were on his team. A rivalry between the best in the class and the worst in class, he realized instantly, not exactly original. With an unnoticed sigh, he suppressed the memories of his long-past teammate. They had been rivals, but ultimately friends in the end. He found himself not exactly looking forward to interacting with this group as he could already tell that they'd stir up a lot of unwanted memories. As usual, Sandaime said, more to himself than the others. He sighed in resignation as he watched the kunoichi beat on a thoroughly terrified blonde. Naruto's right in the middle of some kind of trouble. Hokage-sama, said one of the Junin. Is it really wise to let that boy become a shinobi? What could be wrong with it? Sandaime asked, feeling a slight headache approaching. He knew that this was coming. It pained him to know that even a Junin couldn't tell the difference between Naruto and Kyuubi. He has shown exceptional skills, as I'm sure you've heard of his victory over Mizuki. And it remains up to his Junin instructor to pass him or not. The Junin nodded, accepting the silent order to drop the subject. A three-man squad. This was the collective thought of various genin hopefuls throughout the room. As whispers erupted around the room, many guessing as to who would be pair with who, Ino smirked. It was destiny that she'd be placed with her Sasuke-kun, they were meant for each other. It didn't matter who their third teammate was as long as she could be with Sasuke, preferably alone. Well, someone's gotta be in Sasuke's group, she said down to Sakura who sat a row beneath her, between a still brooding Sasuke and a severely bruised Naruto. I wonder who. She left the sentence hanging. I don't know, Sakura said simply, almost nonchalantly. Glancing back at her once best friend and current rival, she felt her inner Sakura flare up. Duh, I'm gonna be with Sasuke, so stay away from him, you hag. I wanna be with, well, Naruto was having a hard time deciding who he wanted his third teammate to be, since he already knew who he wanted to be with. Well, I don't care, as long as it's not Sasuke-tem. Grunting in disgust at this unfortunate discovery, Sasuke had only one thought on his mind. Groups of 3. That'd only slow me down. As Iruka began announcing the teams, the class was strangely silent. That is until the kids whose names were already been called started talking amongst each other. But that changed with the arrival of Team 7, Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto lifted his head at the sound of his name. Haruno Sakura. After a second's pause, Naruto let out a loud victory cry as Sakura's face fell in depression, and Uchiha Sasuke. In a flash, the blonde and pink-haired teammates' positions were switched, Sakura giving out a victorious yelp and Naruto's face fell as deep depression set in. I won't be with Naruto-kun then, was Hinata's saddened realization. She couldn't help but stare at his drooping head, feeling an urge to rush down there to comfort him. But she couldn't do that, he'd think she was probably some stalker or something. Now, Team 8, Hyuga Hinata, she returned her attention to Iruka and quietly acknowledged her fate. Inuzuka Kiba, the said boy chuckled at finally being called, more than happy at being paired with his beloved Hinata-chan, and Aburame Shino. The said boy merely adjusted his sunglasses. Turning back to Ino, Sakura chucked deviously as she shot her rival a victory V. Her smirk was large and promised to grow in size at the blonde's disbelief and anger. How did you get in his group? She could barely stop herself from yelling that question. Sakura didn't answer, but inner Sakura was cheering, cha-ching. True love conquers all. As Ino was growling and trying to restrain herself from wringing the pink-haired girl's neck, a familiar voice drawled out next to her. I don't get it, Shikamaru said. What do you see in a guy like that? He's not so special. Looking at him in exasperation, she said the first thing that came to her mind. You are so beyond clueless, Shikamaru. Don't you get it? Glancing at her with a slightly jealous and annoyed look, he stated the obvious, no, I don't get it because I'm not a girl. Seeing the jealousy in his gaze and voice, Ino sighed. A small smirk pulled at her lips at the thought that Shikamaru would be jealous over Sasuke having her attentions than him. Like he thought that she was better off with him than the aloof and mysterious Uchiha. "You are so full of yourself," she muttered, leaning her cheek into her palm. "Jealousy is a terrible thing. I'd hate to be on your team." It was at this time that Iruka's voice caught their attention again with the sounds of their names. Team 10. Yamanaka Ino, Nara Shikamaru, and Akamichi Choji. Surprised and slightly angry at this revelation, Ino stared at Iruka. Next to her, Shikamaru couldn't help but chuckle as he threw her words back at her. "Didn't you say something about hating to be on my team?" "Those are all the squads," their sensei said. He'd been holding it since the declaration of Team 7, only out of respect for the remaining teams that needed to be announced. Now that he was done, Naruto felt it was time to change his team or to at least get his questions answered. "Iruka-sensei," he called, standing up in the process and pointing accusingly at Sasuke. "Why does a great shinobi like me have to be in the same group as a slug like Sasuke?" Naruto pointedly ignored Sakura's dangerous glare at insinuating that her Sasuke-kun was weaker than him. No, he was far more concerned with getting his answer. It seemed that Iruka had been expecting this question, so it only took half a second to answer. Sasuke had the best overall scores of all the graduating students. Placing his arms on his hips, he continued, "Naruto, you had the worst scores." This brought a series of chuckles and laughter from the other genin hopefuls. Ignoring them, Iruka continued, "To create a balanced group, we put the best student with the worst student." If Naruto had a reply for that, he didn't get to voice it as Sasuke spoke up for the first time that day. "Just make sure you don't get in my way, Baka." He didn't degrade himself to look at the dobi. Forgetting about ordering Iruka to switch him with someone else, he turned to Sasuke with an angry yell. "Hey, what did you say?" There was no way that self-centered Uchiha said that he'd get in his way. "Hard of hearing?" Sasuke asked, indifferent to Naruto's anger. This brought another wave of laughter from the class. "Sit down, Naruto." Sakura snapped, sick him pestering Sasuke and interrupting her time with him. Clearing throat loudly, Iruka dismissed the class until after lunch. He watched as the members of the new Team 7 quickly exited the room, led by Sasuke with Sakura trailing him closely, followed by Naruto. Iruka couldn't help but think forlorn thoughts. If these first few hours are any indication of the team's future, it isn't looking too good at the moment. "Sasuke, where are you?" Sakura called out, in what she thought was a sweet and innocent voice. She felt a little hurt that he left as soon as they were dismissed. Didn't he want to spend time with her now that they on the same team? Lunch together would have been a great starting point. Right. As these thoughts were going through her mind, she heard a voice that she made her cringe. Oh, how she hated that dobi's very existence. "Hey, Sakura," he called cheerfully as he walked up to her. "I was thinking that since we're on the same team, we could have lunch together and get to know each other better." It was one thing to be followed, it was another that her follower had just mirrored her thoughts. The fact that it was Naruto who was following her had any kind of sweet notions she had turned sour instantly. "Why would I have lunch with you?" she demanded accusingly. How could that thought even cross your mind? If her tone had hurt his feelings, she didn't see it through his expert mask. The fact that she could only see his irritating face still in a smile tickled the anger she'd been harboring all morning. "But we're in the same group and I just thought." "Naruto," she interrupted with a dangerous tone of voice and deadly glare. "You're annoying." Glaring at him for only another moment, she turned and brought her hands up. Calling out in her sweet and innocent voice again, she tried to adopt a similar look on her face. "Sasuke, where are you?" He had half a mind to go after her and try to ask her to have lunch again. But she'd just called him annoying, like he was nothing but a pest or a bug that she'd so much rather squash but couldn't seem to catch. Though he didn't show it, she had hurt his feelings. Later, he sat up on one of the academy's roofs, sulking. He had finally gotten to become a genin, and what happens? Sasuke Tem's on the same team. Not only that, but with his true skills safely hidden and his refusal to show them yet, he couldn't do anything more than play the part that he created years ago. There's got to be a way to deal with, he grumbled. Then a blue shirt by an open window attracted his attention. It was the Tem, eating his rice ball lunch. The bastard thought he was so cool because he didn't hide his skills and everyone else respected them. If only he could be dropped down a few notches, no, a few dozen notches, then he might be a bit more bearable of a teammate. Then inspiration struck him. Got it, he said as a devious grin crossed his face. All right, Ino said, in a foul mood. If we're in the same team, then you've got to follow my lead. That's the only way it'll work. Chewing absent-mindedly on his rice ball, Shikamaru muttered out an annoyed acknowledgement. They sat together out on one of the balconies near the roof. It had a pretty good view of the village, which was why Shikamaru and Choji liked it so much. Ino had taken it upon herself to follow them and instill a leadership role among Tem. Not that he'd raise a finger against her leadership as long as it wasn't a clear mistake. It was still going to be annoying as hell because the blonde was such a control freak. A small movement on the academy wall beneath them a fair ways drew his attention. If it weren't for the familiar blonde hair, he would have had a tough time identifying it as Naruto. Not when he wore a gray uniform similar to what Chunin and Junin wore. Naruto, Shikamaru said quietly, identifying the blonde. This statement drew Ino's attention. They watched as the blonde snuck across the wall, silent as a shadow. The blonde seemed to be heading for the open window where Sasuke stood. Shikamaru had to admit to himself that if it weren't for the blonde's hair, he probably wouldn't have noticed him, especially with the clothes he wore seemed to blend into the academy wall. The pair watched as Naruto suddenly and silently hopped through the window, startling the Uchiha. The movement jarred the window's support strut and it closed behind the blonde. There faintly heard Sasuke's warning growl and Naruto's, pipe down. Naruto, Ino said angrily. If you so much as scratch him, you're on my enemy list, forever. Shikamaru spared her another exasperated glance as the sound of severe beating erupted from behind the closed window. They waited impatiently to see what happened. Then, almost as soon as it started, Sasuke opened the window and hopped out. He smirked as he stood and walked away. Shikamaru was a little disappointed, he was sure that Naruto would have put up more of a fight. Especially when it seemed that he was training himself outside of school. Maybe he just wasn't as talented as Shikamaru gave him credit for. He beat Naruto without even breaking a sweat, he muttered to himself. What did you expect? Ino asked. She was quite proud of her dear Sasuke. It slightly surprised Shikamaru that he'd spoken out loud without realizing it. Naruto against my boy Sasuke. No contest. As he continued to watch Sasuke walk away, he suddenly felt something out of place. Why would Sasuke walk away on the roof? Surely, he could have just taken the stairs, right? And where was Naruto? He knew that the blonde seemed more resilient than anyone else. So shouldn't he be up and around by now? That's when it struck him. The Sasuke walking away on the roof wasn't really Sasuke. It was Naruto. A slight smirk crossed his face at this realization. So he hadn't underestimated the Dobi after all. It had taken him surprisingly longer than he thought it would take. But he didn't finally get himself untied from the unbelievably tight knots that the Dobi restrained him with. How could that Baka possibly perform the Kage Bunshin while utilizing the Kawarimi and some other jutsu he'd never seen before? What happened to the Dobi who couldn't even perform a simple Bunshin? What was that strange technique he used? Just after Naruto had used the Kawarimi and the Kage Bunshins were going to attack, all of the Naruto had formed the Tora seal and blew out a dense cloud of smoke. It was then easy pickings for the blondes to tackle and tie him down. Where did that Dobi learn such a strange jutsu? If the Tora seal was required, then it must have been some fire jutsu. But the Uchiha clan specialized in Kaden jutsu and he'd realized he'd never seen a smokescreen used in the clan before it was destroyed. Did the Dobi create that jutsu? He just couldn't imagine the Baka being able to do that. Yet there was no other explanation. After confronting a badly blushing and rambling Sakura, he walked back to the classroom since the lunch break was close to being over. When a door was thrown open ahead of him, he saw the blonde boy rushing out, once again dressed in his orange jumpsuit. Yelping in surprise, he skidded to a stop a few feet away from Sasuke. Crouching down, as if believing that Sasuke would suddenly attack, which he was seriously considering, the boy demanded, "Sasuke, what are you doing here? How did you get loose?" "I used the escape jutsu," he said, smirking at the blonde's angry expression. He decided to provoke the boy's anger, since he decided to vent his own anger. "Nothing to it, it's a very basic technique, why did you do that, henge into me?" Glaring at the Uchiha, he growled out, "I thought it would be fun to try out my jutsus on you, so I did." He formed a familiar cross seal and in a poof of smoke, 5 Narutos were in the air and diving for him while forming the Tora seal. Grunting in aggravation, he made his annoyance known. "The same jutsu again. Last time I went easy on you," one Naruto snapped. "This time you're going down for the count. Get ready, Sasuke." Then 5 loud groans from the blondes, stomachs roared through the hallway. The boys dropped unceremoniously to the ground, each clutching his stomach while grunting, groaning, and yelling about it. Then they turned and ran for the restroom that was behind them. With 5 blondes trying to force their way through the single doorway at once, a bottleneck was formed and they immediately started shoving and pushing each other to get inside as quickly as they could. "What a loser," Sasuke muttered as he turned around and took the long way back to the classroom. The first impressions went as smoothly as scraping sandpaper across butter. But thanks to each of the kids' reactions to one another, he got a clear estimate on what they thought of one another. "He's late," Naruto whined as the second hour passed. He had his head stuck out through the door, continuously glancing down the hallway impatiently. Sasuke and Sakura, though their pride would never allow them to admit it, both were silently complaining and agreeing with the blonde. "Naruto, just sit down," Sakura said, quite bored. "I don't want to," he said, turning back inside the room. Sasuke ignored the blonde's ranting and wondered yet again how it could have happened. He was best student in class and Naruto was the worst. The outcome should have been obvious. But where the Dobi couldn't even do a simple bunshin only 2 days ago, he now knew how to do the Kinjutsu Kage bunshin. It just didn't make sense to him. How could the Dobi not be able to perform the bunshin at all, yet pull several Kage bunshins out of his without dropping from chakra depletion? His silent musings were cut short as Naruto grabbed an eraser and chair toward the doorway. Wedging the eraser between the door frame and the door, the blonde's chuckles sounded a tad bit like an evil crackle. "Hey, what are you doing?" Sakura demanded, moving closer for a better view. "That's what he gets for coming late," Naruto announced proudly. Hopping off the chair, he let out a triumphant yell of surprise. And quickly placed the chair back in its original spot. "You're asking for trouble," Sakura said, very much like a goody-goody. "You know you shouldn't do that." That's what she said to Naruto, but inside it was a totally different story. Her inner and aggressive side was cringing with anticipation. "I love stuff like this." Though he really didn't care, Sasuke felt he should state the obvious to his oblivious teammate. "Our sensei is a Junin, an elite shinobi. Do you really think that he'll fall for that?" "Yeah," Sakura said, agreeing with her crush instantly. "You're so clueless, Naruto." At that moment, the door slid open, and the eraser landed solidly on the clump of silver hair. There was a second of total silence as the 4 of them realized what had happened. Then, all hell broke loose. The next instant Naruto's loud laughter erupted with a victory cheer. "I got him. He totally fell for it. Hey. Gomen, sensei," Sakura said, trying to appear innocent and thoroughly embarrassed for him. "I told him not to do it, but he wouldn't listen. I'd never do something like that. Perfect shot." Inner Sakura cheered, giving Naruto 2 thumbs up. Even Sasuke was found himself questioning the man's ability. Picking up the eraser, the man stared at it for a moment before entering a thinking pose. Then, more to himself than the genin team, he said, "My first impression of this group, you're a bunch of idiots." The pink-haired girl was obviously openly smitten with the last Uchiha. She clearly held him in the highest regard, and would probably support him whether he was right or wrong on any issue. Yet, at the same time, she seemed to have inherited the village's disgust of her blonde teammate. Though it seemed that her disgust was directed more toward him being a clueless idiot than what the village hated him for. The Uchiha was aloof and quiet. He didn't seem to care what happened around him or his new teammates, or what anyone thought of him. His focus, as Kakashi had guessed long ago, was entirely on killing his older brother. Of course, he did seem to be unusually aggressive to the blonde, like he was taking their unofficial rivalry seriously despite him having the clear advantage. Almost like a sibling rivalry. The blonde seemed unusually easy to decipher at a first glance. He wore a happy-go-lucky grin at all times, had a crush on Sakura, and seemed to take his rivalry with Sasuke just as seriously. Yet, as he introduced himself, Kakashi felt something was out of place. This perspective was largely thanks to years of seeing underneath the underneath. Sure, what the blonde was saying was no doubt true, but it seemed like he was either withholding information or playing a role like an actor. This second assumption of his only increased when Sakura declared her disgust of him. It had taken him nearly a second to react, like he was taking in the information, processing it, then remembering how he needed to act or react. Deciding to put off openly asking the blonde right then and there, after all the answers would come eventually right, Kakashi had explained to them the survival exercise they'd be having. No matter how many genin teams he'd explained this part to, he'd never get over the hilarity of their reactions. It was now 9 in the morning. Kakashi was hidden in the tree cover near the training field his genin team was to report to. He'd been there from the start, watching them as they arrived. Okay, maybe he wasn't watching them exactly but reading his newest volume of Ika Ika Paradise. Besides, it certainly was fun to be terminally late all the time, like Obito always was. After years of copying his dead teammate, Kakashi could finally proclaim with heartfelt honesty that it was very fun to be late and make horrible excuses. Especially the way it always, without fail, irritated everyone around him. Glancing at the sun and deciding that he was sufficiently late, he replaced the book back into his pouch. With a poof of smoke, he appeared on the field near his waiting team. "Yo," he called, with a raised hand. "You're late." Two angry genin yelled at him while the third glared. "Well, a black cat crossed my path," Kakashi said, not bothering trying to hide his smile. Oh, he loved this part. "So I had to take the long way." All the kids just glared at him, instantly seeing through the lie. Naruto and Sakura growled dangerously at him, just itching to beat him into pulp. Oh, he loved his job. Shinobi must be able to conceal their movements and hide effectively. That was one of the most ingrained teachings of the academy into their students. That class was covered more thoroughly than the class of learning to throw kunai or shuriken. After a week-long training session, the academy students were given the task of sneaking from one side of Konoha to the other without being caught by the shinobi planted in among the ranks of the civilians. Many students were eventually caught because they grew careless or reckless. But not Sakura or Sasuke. They now demonstrated how well they'd been taught as they followed Kakashi as he moved to a new clearing by a river. While he could easily detect their chakra levels, he couldn't see them at all. They had indeed been very well trained. Too bad Naruto didn't seem to be in the mind frame of hiding. He appeared in front of Kakashi in a blur and stood proudly on the other end of the field. He had his arms crossed over his chest in what he obviously thought of as his cool pose. "You and me, right now, fair and square." The blonde yelled out. "Let's go." Kakashi threw him an exasperated look. His opinion on the blonde's behavior was summed up perfectly by Sasuke's muttered comment. "Fool. You know," Kakashi said. "Compared to the others, you're a little weird." Huffing arrogantly, Naruto snapped, "Oh yeah. The only thing weird here is your haircut." With that being said, he rushed at the man. Lazily reaching into his bag, Kakashi sighed. This was going to be boring, he was sure. So he might as well do something worthwhile with his time. Seeing his sensei reaching into his pouch had the blonde stop dead in his tracks, giving the man a suspicious gaze. This look intensified as it became clear he had grabbed something. Shinobi Battle Tactics, Part 1, Kakashi said, sounding like a textbook. Taijutsu, the physical part. Taijutsu. Then why is he reaching for a weapon? Naruto wondered as he prepared to snatch a kunai to defend him. But he wasn't prepared for what his sensei finally pulled out, a book. What the? Was Naruto's ever so intelligent remark. What are you waiting for? Kakashi said as he started reading, ignoring the blonde. Make a move. Stuttering slightly as he tried to sum up his thoughts, Naruto found he recognized that book that Kakashi was reading. It was Ika Ika Paradise, a perverted adult book. The fact that his sensei was openly reading it in front of them confounded him slightly. Finally he managed to get out, "Why are you reading that book?" "Why?" the silver-haired man repeated. "To find out what happens in the story, of course, don't let it bother you. With your weak attacks, it really wouldn't matter if I were reading or whatever." That struck a nerve. Kakashi-sensei didn't respect him, huh? Well, he'd just have to make him respect him, especially when he was going to become Hokage in a few years. The anger at being immediately being labeled as weak, before his sensei even took a single punch from him really pissed him off. Far more than Sasuke could have hoped to, that was for sure. "I'm gonna crush you," he screamed as he charged forward and leapt. Despite throwing a punch with all his might, he was stopped cold by Kakashi's hand. What really ticked him off was the fact that he didn't even look up from his book. Landing lightly, he was quick to jump up and throw a powerful kick at his sensei's waist. The Junin merely crouched down swiftly and the kick sailed over his head, barely touching his hair. And he still didn't look up. Backing up, Naruto crouched down for a second and formed the Tori hand seal. Nothing appeared to have happened until he rushed forward again, this time his image was hazy. Out of the corner of his eye all Kakashi saw was an orange haze quickly approaching him. From their hiding places, Sakura and Sasuke stared in surprise at this. What was it that the Baka had just done? They'd been far from impressed when the fight initially started, now they were quite interested. Sakura, from her vantage point, had been the only one to see the hand seal that Naruto formed, so she knew why his body was hazy. But how could he do that? She didn't know of any jutsus that could do that. "Now you're mine," Naruto yelled as his fist closed in on Kakashi. But that was a mistake. Using his voice as a means of figuring his exact location, Kakashi darted around behind him. He got a small grin on his face as he formed the Tora seal. He had to suppress a chuckle as Naruto stopped dead and stared at the spot where he used to be. "Don't let your enemy get behind you all the time," Kakashi said quietly. Recognizing the danger of the Tora seal, Sakura threw stealth to the winds as she yelled out, "Naruto! Get out of there! Quick! He's going to destroy you!" Looking over the direction that he'd heard her voice, he heard another voice directly behind him, too late. All the blonde could do was glance back in time to see Kakashi bringing the Tora seal up and thrusting it up his butt. Kanahagakure Furui Taijutsu no Ugi, Senin Garashi. With a burst of chakra and Naruto's own natural reflex, the blonde was sent flying through the air with an undignified scream of pain and embarrassment. This jutsu had Sakura and Sasuke staring at Kakashi with disgust as they realized the hand seal wasn't even a hand seal. The man merely returned to reading his book. Then a pair of shuriken erupted from the water and raced at Kakashi. As the man made to catch the weapons, they suddenly exploded and were replaced by a pair of cage buncheons. Glancing up in surprise, Kakashi was rewarded with a fist in the face and another in the gut. But before the buncheons could do more damage, he swept his leg up and around and crushed them. Walking over to the river as a blonde head surfaced, he absently rubbed his aching jaw. That had actually hurt. Sputtering as he climbed onto shore, Naruto glared up his sensei. But that glare died as he saw him rubbing his jaw. Standing up weakly, he grinned viciously. "That was for nailing me the butt. You're looking awfully confident for someone can barely stand," Kakashi observed. "I suppose using cage buncheon drains your reserves much quicker than I thought. What do you expect when I'm starving to death, Baka-sensei?" he yelled. But that's not going to stop me, because I'm going to be Hokage one day, believe it. Then 6 more orange blurs leapt out of the river and shouted at the same time, emphasizing the point, I will become a shinobi. The fact that the blonde was using the same jutsu saddened Kakashi somewhat. He'd always been hearing of how the blonde was an ingenious prankster. But it didn't seem like that part of him carried over into his shinobi skills. Still, genin or not, he was forced to put his book back in his bag with a defeated sigh since he would likely need both hands. You can't beat me with this jutsu, Naruto, he said as the 7 blondes charged him. Then something happened that truly caught him by surprise. Something jumped onto him from behind. Glancing back he caught sight of a clump of blonde hair. An 8 clone. Then 6 others grabbed onto his legs as he was distracted by the Naruto on his back. Didn't you say, don't let your enemy get behind you? The blondes asked as he watched the final Naruto jump high into the air. Good advice, sensei. Get ready to see my best creations. The Naruto in the air yelled as all of them formed the Tora seal. What was going on? Kakashi wondered. No way that they can use a fire jutsu, even a low level one, when they so close. But he watched in surprise as all the Narutos took a huge breath of air. Okay, maybe he will. Just as he was ready to use the Kawarimi jutsu, he saw the Naruto exhale, a cloud of smoke. The smoke wasn't toxic but he couldn't see anything. Not even when something hit him hard in the stomach. Utilizing his superior strength, Kakashi broke free of the bunchins and leapt high and far from the smokescreen. Gotcha! 3 voices yelled from around him. The 3 Narutos were converging on him and since he was suspended in the air, he couldn't necessarily react to dodge them. So he did the only thing he could do. Kawarimi no Jutsu. From his new vantage point in a tree, he watched as the 3 Naruto destroyed the clone he'd switched with. Dropping to the ground, the Naruto looked amongst one another and then silently the bunchin disappeared. Kuso. Naruto yelled to the sky, trying to vent his frustration. So the prankster has a temper problem. This thought brought a smirk to the Junin's face as a devious idea came to him. Using his incredible speed, he quickly set up a double-layered snare trap using one of the bells as bait. The gleam of the bell caught the blonde's attention easily. Kakashi's smirk grew as he watched the blonde jump to conclusions and run for the bell. But just as he was about to trip the first trap, the blonde hesitated for a second. Then he nearly placed his foot 3 inches to left of where it would have landed and snatched up the bell. This surprised Kakashi. The blonde had seen the double-layered trap. Nice try, Baka-sensei. Naruto called out, looking directly at him despite him being hidden. But you can't prank the prank master. Stepping out from behind the tree and the genjutsu, Kakashi looked quizzically at him. He had seriously underestimated this dobi, this boy. That didn't happen often to him. But just because of his own error, he couldn't simply pass the blonde. Not when that was not the point of the exercise. Very true, Naruto, Kakashi said. I'll remember that next time. I'll keep this, Kakashi-sensei. The blonde closed his eyes as his foxy grin grew very large. He held up the bell victoriously. But it was this instant that was all the former Anbu needed. Keep what? The Junin asked, curiously. The bell, the blonde said as he looked at where it used to be. Huh, the bell. What? You mean this bell? Kakashi asked as he held up the item with same victorious gesture that Naruto had used. The blonde stared up at it, quite surprised. But that surprise was slaughtered as anger boiled over. That's not fair, sensei. He screamed. I got that bell fair and square. Now give it back. No, Naruto, Kakashi said with a finality in his voice. You have to take the bell from me. Not pick it up off the ground after a failed trap. Fine, Naruto yelled as he rushed forward. Then I'll take it from you again. With one punch, the blonde was sent flying across the field. He hit a tree and slumped to ground, apparently unconscious. Well, that was certainly a unique experience, he thought as he replaced the bell with the other and made to pull out his book. However, the sound of kunai whizzing through the air attracted his attention. It could only be the Uchiha. Sighing in annoyance, he did the Kawarimi again. As he caught sight of where the weapons had come from, the Junin couldn't help but wonder. Do the rest of this genin team would have as unique and surprising abilities as Naruto?